When the lawyer handed Abigail the deed, the land was buried under 12 feet of muddy river water. Everyone told her to walk away. They called it a worthless, drowned graveyard. But what the flood destroyed on the surface, it washed away to reveal a century-old secret underneath. The mahogany conference room at Henderson and Boyle smelled of lemon polish and quiet defeat. Abigail Preston sat in a stiff leather chair, staring at the brass nameplate on the desk. Opposite her sat her older brother, Marcus, incessantly tapping his Rolex against the glass tabletop, a nervous habit he had developed only after he'd married into money and decided everyone else was moving too slowly. "Read the codicil again, Richard," Marcus demanded, his voice tight with irritation. Richard Boyle, an estate attorney who looked as though he hadn't slept since the late 90s, pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "It is quite clear, Marcus. The liquid assets, totaling $42,000, the mutual funds, and the vintage Chevrolet are left to you. The entirety of Oakhaven Farm, all 214 acres in Bellerive County, is left to Abigail." Marcus let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Oakhaven? Are you kidding me? The levee broke 3 weeks ago. The entire property is at the bottom of a lake, right now. It's a total loss. FEMA is practically condemning the whole valley." Abigail kept her eyes on the folder in front of Richard. She didn't say a word. She was 34, fresh out of a brutal, financially devastating divorce from a man who had systematically drained her savings, and she was currently living in a cramped second-floor apartment that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. To her, 200 acres of anything sounded like a kingdom, even if it was currently underwater. "Grandpa Arthur knew what he was doing," Abigail said softly, her voice raspy from crying the night before. Arthur Preston had been the only father figure she'd ever truly known. While Marcus was off at boarding school, Abigail had spent her summers at Oakhaven, learning to drive a tractor, harvest sweet corn, and listen to the old man tell wild, rambling stories about their ancestors who had settled the Missouri riverbanks during Prohibition. "What he was doing was losing his mind," Marcus snapped. "Abby, listen to me. The property is ruined. The farmhouse is submerged up to the gutters. The soil is contaminated with river sludge. You can't farm it. You can't live on it. And the county is going to start levying fines for the environmental cleanup the second the water recedes." "It's my problem now, Tommy," she replied, refusing to look at him. "Actually," Richard Boyle interrupted gently, sliding a crisp, white envelope across the table toward Abigail, "there is an alternative. A land development firm, Apex Holdings, has been making aggressive bids on flooded properties in the Bellerive Basin. They approached us yesterday. They are willing to offer you $50,000 for the deed as is. No cleanup required on your part." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "Take it, Abby. 50 grand. It's a lifeline. You're drowning in legal debt from the divorce. Pay off your ex's car note, get a decent apartment, and wash your hands of that muddy swamp." Abigail stared at the envelope. $50,000 was a fraction of what the land was worth dry. But as a flooded wasteland, it was a miracle offer. But something felt wrong. Why would a corporate holding company want 200 acres of contaminated, submerged farmland? She thought of her grandfather's calloused hands, the way he would look out over the cornfields at dusk, puffing on his pipe. "The dirt remembers, Abby," he used to tell her. "People lie, paper burns, but the dirt holds on to everything you bury in it." "Who is the representative for Apex Holdings?" Abigail asked. Richard checked a secondary file. "A Mr. Gregory Finch." Abigail frowned. She didn't know the name, but the urgency of the offer felt predatory. They were circling her like vultures before the body was even cold. "I'm not selling," Abigail said, her voice finding its steel. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "You are an idiot. You always were overly sentimental, Abby. You're going to bankrupt yourself holding on to a swamp." "It's my swamp," she said, standing up and taking the deed from the table. "Thank you, Richard. I'll be in touch." 2 hours later, Abigail parked her battered Honda Civic on the shoulder of State Route 47. She stood by the guardrail, the harsh afternoon sun beating down on her neck. Below her, where the sprawling green expanse of Oak Haven Farm used to be, there was only a vast, terrifying expanse of brown water. The current was slow and lazy, carrying shattered lumber, plastic coolers, and uprooted trees. About a half-mile out, she could see the very peak of the farmhouse's slate roof, rising above the waterline like a tombstone. The massive oak tree that gave the farm its name was halfway underwater, its branches drooping into the muck. The sheer scale of the devastation hit her like a physical blow. Her brother was right. It was gone. Everything Arthur had built, everything she remembered, was drowned. She fell to her knees in the gravel, the fight draining out of her, and wept until her ribs ached. But as the sun began to set, painting the muddy water in shades of violent orange and bruised purple, a strange resolve settled over her. She had nothing else to lose. No husband, no career, no money. All she had was this drowned land. She wasn't going to let some faceless corporation steal it from her. She would wait for the water to leave. It took 3 agonizing months for the river to finally retreat into its banks. By late August, the Missouri heat was sweltering, baking the floodplain into a cracked, desolate moonscape of gray silt and rotting vegetation. Abigail had spent those months fending off a barrage of harassment. Gregory Finch had proven to be relentless. He called her daily. He sent couriers to her apartment. The offers slowly crept up. $60,000, then $75,000, and finally a flat $100,000. The escalating price only solidified Abigail's suspicion. Finch wasn't looking for a tax write-off. He wanted something specific on that land. When the county finally lifted the barricades on the access roads, Abigail drove her car as far as the mud would allow, parked, and pulled on a pair of heavy rubber waders. The smell was the first thing that hit her, a thick, putrid stench of dead fish, stagnant algae, and rotting wood. She trudged up the long driveway, her boots sinking inches into the slick sludge with every step. The farmhouse was a total loss. The water had gutted the first floor, shattering windows and leaving behind a thick layer of toxic mud over the hardwood floors. The furniture was a swollen, unrecognizable mess. She spent the first week doing nothing but shoveling mud out of the living room, sleeping in a cheap pop-up tent on the highest ridge of the property, surviving on canned soup and instant coffee. Marcus had stopped calling her entirely. Her friends from her married life had quietly distanced themselves. It was just Abigail and the ruined earth. On the 8th day, a black SUV rolled up to the edge of her property line. Abigail leaned on her shovel, wiping sweat and dirt from her forehead, as a man in a pristine grey suit stepped out into the mud, grimacing as it coated his expensive Italian shoes. "Abigail Preston," the man called out, picking his way carefully toward her. "Who's asking?" she shot back, gripping the shovel a little tighter. "Gregory Finch," he said, offering a tight, artificial smile. He was in his late 40s, with slicked-back hair and eyes that looked like flat grey stones. "I represent Apex Holdings. We've been trying to reach you. I told my lawyer I'm not selling. Tell Apex to buy someone else's disaster." Finch stopped a few yards away, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to dab his forehead. "Miss Preston, let's be reasonable. The county is going to hit you with ecological hazard fines by the end of the month. You have no power, no running water, and you're living in a tent. I am authorized to offer you $150,000. Right now. A cashier's check is in my car." Abigail stared at him. 150,000. It was life-changing money. It meant freedom. But then she looked at Finch's eyes. They weren't looking at her. They were darting past her, toward the ruins of the old tobacco barn at the back of the property. The oldest structure on the farm, built by her great-grandfather in 1918. The flood had collapsed its roof, but the stone foundation remained intact. "Why do you want it, Mr. Finch?" she asked quietly. "And don't give me the corporate redevelopment script. You're sweating. You drove out to a toxic mud pit in a $1,000 suit, and you're offering me triple what the land is worth dry. What's out here?" Finch's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of pure annoyance. "You're an arrogant woman, Miss Preston. You're holding on to a corpse. If you don't sell, we'll just buy the tax liens when you inevitably default and take it from you for pennies. Your choice." He turned on his heel and marched back to his SUV, leaving deep tracks in the mud. Abigail watched him drive away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back at the collapsed tobacco barn. The dirt remembers. The next morning, dark storm clouds gathered on the horizon, threatening a torrential summer downpour. Abigail knew she had to secure the perimeter of the old barn before the rain washed more of the unstable topsoil away. She fired up an old gas-powered water pump she'd rented with her last few dollars, using a high-pressure hose to blast the thick layers of hardened mud away from the barn's stone foundation. For hours, she worked in the blistering humidity, her muscles screaming in protest. Suddenly, the ground beneath her boots groaned. Abigail scrambled backward, just as the earth gave way. The massive volume of floodwater had scoured the earth beneath the topsoil, creating a subterranean void. With a wet, sucking sound, a sinkhole the size of a minivan opened up right at the edge of the barn's foundation. Abigail lay on her back in the mud, panting, staring at the jagged edge of the hole. If she had been standing 2 feet to the left, she would have fallen in. Cautiously, she crawled to the edge and peered down into the darkness. She expected to see broken pipes, or perhaps an old septic tank. Instead, the high-pressure water from her hose had washed away a century of dirt to reveal smooth, reinforced concrete. And set right into the center of the concrete was a massive, rusted steel vault door, complete with a heavy, spoked locking wheel. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a root cellar. This was a subterranean bank vault, hidden directly beneath the barn. She scrambled down the slick sides of the sinkhole, her hands sliding over the freezing, rusted steel of the door. The locking wheel was seized with decades of rust and mud. She grabbed her crowbar from her tool belt, wedged it between the spokes of the wheel, and threw her entire body weight against it. Nothing. Rain began to fall, fat drops splattering against the metal hatch. The hole was going to fill with water. If she didn't open it now, it might be buried forever. "Come on!" she screamed, driving the heel of her boot against the crowbar with all her might. With a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot, the rust seal broke. The heavy wheel spun, grinding against its ancient gears. Abigail grabbed the locking latch and pulled upward. The heavy steel door groaned, resisting for a moment, before swinging outward with a rush of stale, incredibly cold air. Abigail clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight and shone the beam into the dark abyss. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The beam of light illuminated a sprawling, concrete-lined room. It was bone dry, sealed perfectly against the flood by the heavy door. Stacked against the far wall were dozens of wooden crates, stamped with faded Canadian shipping logos from the 1920s. But it wasn't the crates that made her drop to her knees. Arranged neatly on a heavy iron table in the center of the room were 5 weathered leather satchels. The leather had degraded, splitting open at the seams. Spilling out of them, glinting dully in the flashlight beam, were dozens, no hundreds, of solid gold ingots. Abigail reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the cold, heavy metal of a gold bar. It was real. It was impossible. But it was real. Her grandfather's stories about their bootlegging ancestors weren't just tall tales. They had been the bankers for the Midwest Prohibition Syndicate, hiding their illicit wealth beneath the very soil they farmed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the opening of the sinkhole above her. Abigail froze, the flashlight beam catching the edge of the metal hatch. "I told you, Miss Preston," a cold voice echoed down into the vault. "You should have taken the money." Abigail looked up. Standing at the rim of the sinkhole, silhouetted against the stormy sky, was Gregory Finch, and he was holding a gun. The heavy summer rain began to fall in earnest, slicking the sides of the sinkhole and turning the clay into a treacherous, icy slide. Abigail froze at the bottom of the concrete pit, her flashlight beam illuminating the rusted steel hatch, the gleaming gold, and finally, the dark silhouette of Gregory Finch looming above her. The gun in his hand was a compact, matte black Glock. It didn't tremble. "I have to admit, you have far more grit than your brother, Abigail," Finch called down, his voice barely rising above the drumming rain. "Marcus would have folded the second I offered him 50,000. But you had to dig." Abigail's mind raced, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly lowered the flashlight so it wasn't blinding him, but kept the beam angled enough to see his face. "Apex Holdings isn't a land development firm, is it?" Finch let out a short, humorless laugh. "Apex is a shell corporation I registered in Delaware 3 years ago, specifically for this property. But my actual name isn't Finch. It's Gregory O'Bannon. Does that mean anything to you?" Abigail searched her memory. Grandpa Arthur's rambling stories about the Prohibition days echoed in her mind. The O'Bannon Syndicate out of St. Louis. River runners, whiskey smugglers who used the Missouri River to move Canadian liquor down to Memphis. "My great-grandfather worked for your family," Abigail said, her voice echoing in the concrete chamber. "Your great-grandfather, Harrison Preston, was our primary accountant and landkeeper," Finch O'Bannon corrected coldly. "In the winter of 1928, the feds raided our warehouses in St. Louis. My grandfather went to the Leavenworth for 20 years. The syndicate collapsed, but our treasury, over $3 million in raw, untraceable gold bullion, vanished. Harrison claimed the feds seized it. My family always knew he was lying, but he was smart. He never spent a dime of it. He just sat on this muddy farm, playing the humble dirt farmer until the day he died." "And Arthur knew," Abigail whispered, realizing why her grandfather had never sold the land, never taken a mortgage against it, and why he had left it to her, the only person stubborn enough to hold on to it. "Arthur knew exactly what was buried under the tobacco barn," Finch said, wiping rain from his eyes. "But he was too much of a coward to launder it. I've been watching this farm for a decade, waiting for the old man to die. Then the levee broke, and I thought the river was going to do my dirty work for me. Drive you out? Let me buy the land for pennies and excavate the vault in peace. But you just wouldn't leave." Finch gestured sharply with the barrel of the gun. "There should be heavy canvas sacks in those crates. Start loading the bars, Abigail. Toss them up to the rim. And don't try anything heroic. You're alone in a flooded valley." Abigail looked at the gold, then at the heavy wooden crates. If she handed up the gold, he would shoot her. There was no doubt in her mind. A sinkhole on a condemned, flooded property was the perfect grave. She would be just another tragic casualty of the Bellerive County flood. She needed a weapon. Her eyes darted around the vault. The crowbar was resting near her boots, too heavy to throw accurately. But then she saw it. The high-pressure hose she had been using to clear the mud was dangling over the edge of the sinkhole, the heavy brass nozzle resting just 3 feet from her left hand. Above ground, the gas-powered pump was still idling loudly, providing a steady, throbbing hum that masked the sound of her shifting her weight. "I need a second," Abigail yelled up, faking a sob. "The leather is rotted, it's falling apart. Use your shirt if you have to. Move," Finch snapped, taking a step closer to the unstable rim to aim the gun directly at her chest. That was his mistake. Abigail lunged to the left, diving into the mud at the base of the sinkhole. Her hand locked around the brass nozzle of the pressure hose. She gripped the heavy metal trigger and yanked it backward, aiming the nozzle directly at the edge of the pit where Finch was standing. A jet of water, pressurized to 3,000 pounds per square inch, blasted upward. It didn't hit Finch. It hit the heavily saturated, unstable clay embankment directly beneath his expensive Italian shoes. The earth simply dissolved. With a shout of surprise, Finch lost his footing as the ground gave way. His gun fired wildly into the air, the crack of the gunshot swallowed by the storm. A massive wave of mud, water, and roots collapsed inward. Abigail pressed herself flat against the heavy steel vault door as a landslide of debris crashed into the pit. Finch tumbled down the embankment, screaming as he slammed hard into the concrete floor of the vault, his leg twisting beneath him with a sickening crunch. The gun flew from his grip, skittering across the wet concrete into the dark corner of the chamber. For a second there was only the sound of the rain and the idling pump. Finch was groaning in agony, clutching his shattered femur. Abigail didn't hesitate. She scrambled over the pile of collapsed mud, grabbed her crowbar, and stood over him, her chest heaving. She didn't look like a broken divorcee anymore. Covered in river sludge, her eyes wild, she looked like the guardian of Oakhaven. "Don't move," she gasped, her knuckles white around the iron bar. Finch spit bloody mud from his mouth, glaring up at her in pure hatred. "You're dead, Preston." Abigail reached into her waterproof jacket, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed 911. "This is Abigail Preston at Oakhaven Farm. I need the county sheriff and an ambulance. I have an armed trespasser subdued on my property." She looked down at the sprawling fortune in gold, then back at the man bleeding on the concrete. "And tell Sheriff Miller he's going to want to call the FBI." The aftermath was a hurricane of flashing lights, yellow police tape, and federal agents. For 3 weeks, Oakhaven Farm was the most heavily guarded piece of real estate in the American Midwest. Gregory Finch, whose real name was indeed confirmed as Gregory O'Bannon by the FBI, was arrested and charged with armed robbery, attempted murder, and federal wire fraud. Because he had fired a weapon during the commission of a felony, he was looking at 20 years in federal prison. But dealing with Finch was the easy part. Dealing with the United States government was another war entirely. The IRS and the Department of Justice immediately moved to seize the gold, citing it as the proceeds of historical organized crime. They slapped a federal injunction on the property, and for a terrifying month, Abigail thought she had fought to survive, only to lose it all to the state. That was when Richard Boyle, her loyal but out-of-his-depth estate attorney, brought in William Hackett. Hackett was a St. Louis lawyer who specialized in antiquities, treasure trove laws, and complex property litigation. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and he took Abigail's case on contingency. The government's case relies on the Bank Secrecy Act and civil asset forfeiture, Hackett explained to Abigail as they sat in a federal courthouse in November. But they have a massive burden of proof problem. That gold was buried in 1928. There are no living witnesses. There is no paper trail linking Harrison Preston directly to the O'Bannon Syndicate's illegal alcohol sales. As far as the law is concerned, this is mislaid property found on private land by the legal landowner. It took 8 grueling months of litigation. Hackett unearthed precedents dating back to the Civil War, arguing that because the gold was legally minted bullion prior to the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, and because it was discovered securely hidden within the boundaries of a private estate, it belonged to the heirs of that estate. In the end, the government settled. They couldn't definitively prove the gold was stolen, but they weren't about to let Abigail walk away tax-free. Under the settlement, the federal and state governments took a staggering 45% of the total value in estate, windfall, and historical taxes. Abigail didn't care. When the final appraisal came through from the Treasury Department, the 400 gold ingots were valued at current market rates. After taxes, legal fees, and Hackett's cut, Abigail Preston walked away with just over $9.2 million. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the following April, Abigail stood on the newly paved driveway of Oak Haven Farm. The floodwaters were a distant memory. The county had finally finished the environmental cleanup, funded entirely by Abigail. She hadn't sold the farm to developers. Instead, she had hired a massive crew of local contractors. The old tobacco barn had been meticulously rebuilt on its original stone foundation, now serving as a state-of-the-art agricultural processing center. The farmhouse was completely restored, combining modern architecture with the original 19th-century timber framing. The toxic sludge had been remediated, the soil turned and treated, and the fields were already prepped for the spring planting of sustainable soybeans and winter wheat. A sleek silver Mercedes pulled up the driveway, crunching over the fresh gravel. Abigail watched as her brother, Marcus, stepped out. He looked exactly the same, but the arrogant swagger was gone. He looked tired. Rumor in the family was that his wealthy wife was filing for divorce, and his business ventures had tanked. He walked up to the porch, his eyes scanning the massive, multi-million-dollar renovation of the property he had once called a drowned graveyard. "Abby," Marcus said, offering a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Place looks incredible. You really pulled it off." "Hello, Tommy," she said, leaning against the wooden railing. She didn't invite him inside. "Listen," Marcus started, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know we had some harsh words at the lawyer's office last year. I was just stressed. But we're family. And honestly, I'm in a bit of a tight spot right now. I have some bridge loans coming due, and since Grandpa Arthur's money was technically family money." Abigail looked at him. She felt no anger anymore, just a profound, quiet clarity. "Grandpa Arthur left the money to the land, Tommy," she said softly. "The deed was very clear. You got the mutual funds and the Chevy. I got the farm, and everything on it and under it." "Abby, be reasonable. It's $9 million. You can't just hoard it." "I'm not hoarding it. I'm farming it." She stepped off the porch, walked over to one of the newly built flower beds, and scooped up a handful of rich, dark, turning topsoil. She walked back and held it out to him. You told me I was going to bankrupt myself holding on to a swamp. You told me to take 50 grand and run. You abandoned this place. You abandoned me. She dropped the soil back into the planter and wiped her hands on her jeans. The dirt remembers, Tommy, and so do I. Have a safe drive back to the city. She turned her back on him and walked into the beautiful sunlit farmhouse, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind her. Abigail walked into the living room, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She looked out the massive bay windows at the sprawling green acreage of Oakhaven. The oak tree that had been submerged in muddy water was budding with vibrant green leaves, its deep roots having survived the flood, anchoring it firmly to the earth. She smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. The storm had come, the water had risen, and it had tried to wash her away. But all it had done was uncover the foundation of who she really was. If Abigail's incredible journey of resilience, hidden treasure, and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, we want to hear from you. Would you have had the courage to hold on to the flooded farm, or would you have taken the money and run? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life stories.